Yeah, whenever you go to talk to someone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Next. Like a dog collar like this?
Good afternoon.
Can I just hold it?
Let's get started. Before I make my announcement and introduce our speakers today, I would like to invite Tiffany to make.
Hi, I'm the president of the Alliance for Energy Policy, and we're actually co-sponsoring this talk today. I want to invite all of you guys to come out to the happy hour with us after this. We're going to be walking over to Crown and Anchor, and we've got, well, AAP will be giving out some pictures, so first few people that are there get free drinks.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and thank you for AAP for co-sponsoring this. If there are other student bodies around here, we do co-sponsor. There is a lot of things we can do together, so feel free to reach out to me or to Trevor with ideas for future speakers or future events. Our speaker next week is going to be Dr. Fred Veach, who is an Assistant Director of Energy at the Energy Institute here at UT Austin, and he'll talk to us on feeding the dragon, energy in China. And it's actually a 2-series talk, so Fred speaks next week, and a week from then, Joanna Leavis, who is an associate professor at Georgetown University, she'll talk about energy innovation and competitiveness, especially looking at energy in China. So we are going to have fun the next 2 weeks also. We'll continue the fun. We have a very special event lined up today. We have really the selection of the folks who have been behind a lot of the important things that have been going on in the renewables in Texas market. Let me start by introducing our speakers in the order they are going to speak. Begin with Colin Meehan, who is a recent graduate from UT, from the Energy and Earth Resources Program in 2013. He has been around at many places, very experienced guy, worked at ICF International, more recently at Converge, was the climate policy manager at EDF, and currently he's the director of regulatory and public affairs for First Solar, which is one of the nation's largest and perhaps world's largest solar companies. Our second speaker is going to be Spivey Paup, who is also a recent graduate from UT. He went to the Macomb School. Spivey is the senior solar development manager at E.ON Renewables and Climate, North America, and he has over the years really been very central in and being part of the renewables market in Texas from the very inception, has been central in developing large-scale wind farms and solar farms across the country. So we really look forward to hearing from his on-the-ground experience over the years and how things have changed and evolved. And then last but not least, Clay Butler, who founded the Butler firm here in Austin and is the managing partner. They are behind a lot of the big, important developments and deals that get done in Texas. He brings a very unique perspective, which is becoming more and more important in the Texas market. He also serves on the Electric Utility Commission of Austin Energy, and I co-serve with him. So it's a pleasure to see you at a different forum. And he is also on the board of directors of the Texas Solar Energy Industry Association and wears many other hats. So please join me in welcoming our panelists today.
All right, thanks. You guys hear me okay? Oh, wow, yeah, okay, that's working. So it's pretty cool, yeah, I just graduated last year. I really didn't think I'd be on, one of Dr. Rai's Energy Symposium panels for at least a few years. I kind of hoped when I was sitting in the audience. So this is really fun for me. Like Dr. Rai said, I work for First Solar now. I'm not going to talk too much about First Solar. I'm really going to talk about where the solar market is today, in particular in Texas, but in general in the U.S. And so I'm going to go through really quick because I love getting to the questions, and I know we all do. So, the first thing I wanted to talk about is where we are on the cost curve. And this is I figured I wouldn't usually use this chart, but this is a bunch of graduate students. I can use a logarithmic axis, and people will kind of get it. And so, this is basically just showing, back in 1998, prices were around $8 a watt, and this is for solar panels. I'm sorry, no, this is actually installed cost. And this comes from Citigroup, by the way. So prices were around $8 a watt. Now we're down to, and this is on utility scale solar, which is really what I'm going to focus on. That's what our company does. So these are the big solar power plants, you know, tens of thousands of acres, tens of hundreds of megawatts, however you want to think about it. But you know, today they're down at $1.60 a watt. So they were at about $8. Now they're down to $1.60, and we're really getting into a place where solar is directly competing against peaking natural gas and, you know, other generation resources. And what I thought would be interesting to talk about is, what does that mean for because I'm a policy guy, what does that mean in the policy world today, and for people like ERCOT who are trying to figure out what the next thing is going to be in the energy industry. And my background when I worked at ICF Consulting was as a wholesale market modeler, so that's kind of one of the things I always go back to. And when you think about wholesale market modeling, a lot of what you look at is the levelized cost of energy, cents per kilowatt hour. And so this is where solar is right now in terms of levelized cost. And this is kind of a range. This is, you know, sort of an estimate that the Texas Solar Power Association put together for West Texas utility scale solar. And we've never been there before, you know. I mean, this is just great. This is a base load natural gas plant. This is a peaker over here, and this is base load. And so if you can get a really cheap solar plant, you're cheaper than base load generation right now. And that's just, you know, in my view, it's a huge step, and it's also one that hasn't been recognized, I think, by a lot of the folks that are doing the modeling that guides public policy. And we've been, through our industry organizations and myself directly through talking to ERCOT, we've been working with ERCOT, and they do some long-term planning processes where they make assumptions on, you know, what are the costs of different generation technologies, and based on those costs and other trends, what do they think is going to be built over the next 10 to 20 years. What they're using currently, I'm sorry, I go back and forth between dollars per watt and dollars per kilowatt, but, you know, again, you're grad students, you should get it. So currently they're using $3,000 a kilowatt, and we're at, you know, $1,600 a kilowatt today, as I just said. So they've got a pretty high cost assumption. That's equivalent to about 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So, you know, that's up around this level, to give you an idea. And when they do their wholesale modeling, they're showing that at that level, at $3,000 a kilowatt hour, or kilowatt, sorry, you don't really build any solar in the next couple of years. But they are showing prices going down over about 15 years to around $1,500 a kilowatt, which is much closer to where we are today. And then they're showing in about, I think it's 2021, they start seeing some real capacity builds. And I'll go to the next slide in a second and show that. But the issue is, when ERCOT is making these forecasts today using these outdated assumptions, and this is not to be critical of ERCOT, because as I'll show, you know, everybody's doing this. The rapid change in technology, and this is, of course, you know, one of Dr. Rye's great areas of research, but the innovation that's going on in the solar industry, the rapid change in technology, cost, and performance, has really caught, I think, the sort of policy world off guard. And so they're all making these really high assumptions. The Energy Information Administration, they do an annual energy outlook every year. They're assuming an even higher cost for solar. And they look at it kind of on a national basis, and so there may be some higher costs in some places of the country, but $3,500 a kilowatt hour, or kilowatt, I'm sorry, is just, in my view, it's not supported. The Brattle Group, again, they assume a fairly high number. And what's interesting is when you dig into this number, and actually ERCOT uses this Brattle analysis for their number to get that $3,000. When you dig into this, you find out that Brattle Group is basing it on a 2012 EPI report that actually used information from 2011 from the Solar Energy Industries Association, which is the same report that is now saying it's at $1,600 a kilowatt. So the point being, there's a lot of hesitation, and a lot of times the people that are sort of doing this modeling and trying to guide public policy are saying, well, you know, we know there are these new reports out that say the cost of solar is a lot lower, but is that really true? We'd rather stick with a tried and true Brattle Group analysis or something like that. But again, when you dig into it, the Brattle Group is ultimately looking to a report from somebody who is looking to that same, you know, original industry report just from 3 years ago. The problem in all this is right here, and I'm sorry, this is a little bit of an ugly chart, but this is the cost. This is ERCOT's forecast on the dollar per kilowatt cost of solar. This is starting at $3,000, going down to about $1,500. They had originally done a forecast that was sort of, you know, a more rapid decline, getting in 2017 or 2018 down to $1,500. And in my view, this is a much more realistic cost curve. But the way that it works at ERCOT, and I'm sorry, I'm guessing you guys, most of you probably know what ERCOT is, but they're the grid operator for Texas, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. And they actually worked on these sort of things through a stakeholder process. So basically what happened was a lot of of the stakeholders had some pushback and said there's no way that solar is going to be that cheap by 2017. And so you need to have a more realistic assessment, and so ERCOT went back to the straddle analysis. And of course, this green dotted line is where prices actually are today for solar. So what you're seeing when ERCOT does this long-term system assessment is you start seeing a little bit of capacity being built in 2021, and they only do every couple of years in their analysis. They don't do every single year, and they only start in 2018. So you wouldn't see anything until here regardless. But you start seeing a few builds in the early years. And then you start to see some real builds in the out years, which is kind of a surprise. I think ERCOT hasn't shown that historically. It was really just last year that they started seeing the solar is actually going to be cost competitive relatively soon. So we've worked with ERCOT a little bit, and they've done just a small kind of a sample run looking at a cost that's a little bit more realistic and closer to where we are today, $1,700. And when you look at that, look at that. This is the first year that you could build, and they're showing that you would start building solar generation in their first model year. And you know, a lot of this is just estimation at this point because they haven't done a full study. But basically the implication of this is that, in my view, the people that are developing policy around solar in Texas aren't really ready for what's going to happen, whether it's a need for additional transmission, which at this point I don't think is really going to be an issue in the near term, or just other, you know, understanding what's going to happen in the market in Texas with solar. One of the big things that's going on, obviously, is the EPA Rule 111D, the Clean Power Rule. This is the carbon regulation. And if we're going to be building this much solar, that has a huge impact on how much it's going to cost for us to comply with that rule. So it's actually going to be a lot cheaper than even the EPA thinks, I believe. And that's you know, that's just one example of where this sort of lag between the people that are developing these analyses and the actual on-the-ground, you know, facts of solar costs, that lag really isn't helpful when we're talking about bigger public policy issues. So I'll just kind of end there, and we can get to Spivey, who can talk about how it really works with solar, because I don't know that. There's a pointer up there, too.
Great. Hi. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Colin. So I'm a project developer for a company called E.ON, and what I do is I actually manage the process from site selection to construction of these utility-scale power plants. I currently develop solar plants. I used to develop wind farms, and my job's a little weird. It's a little niche, I guess you could say. It's part landman, part commercial real estate developer, part jigsaw puzzle assembler. And I'll tell you, and I'll explain why. People like to say you need three things to site a renewable energy power plant, wind or solar farm. You need land, transmission, and a good resource, meaning strong wind or strong solar irradiation. I tend to agree with that. Those are the fundamentals behind a solar project or a wind project. I would argue that the fourth leg there is offtake or energy sales and how you're going to sell that power, whether it's a long-term contract with the utility or it's selling it merchant on the spot market. But to start off, we need a site, and so we need to focus on the transmission grid, which is shown. We have a laser here. No, that doesn't matter. It's shown. This is an old map, but this is a map of the transmission system in Texas, and it shows these colorful lines are what are called CREZ lines, competitive renewable energy zones lines, transmission lines, large-scale transmission lines that have now been built out to predominantly strong wind pockets in West Texas to bring that wind energy back to the load centers in our part of the state. So what I do is I focus on that transmission grid, and I try to find suitable pieces of land so that I can connect my power plant ultimately to that transmission system. And so these lines have been built out, and there's probably going to be less wind built onto those systems, at least in the short term, than was projected. And so solar is actually primed and ready to take advantage of that excess capacity. I think that's what Colin was referring to. The other thing I want to look at if I want to site a project is how good is my resource, my solar irradiation here, or my wind resource, how windy is it in an area. So I want to kind of correlate all of those things: available land, transmission access, and a good, strong resource. And that's how I generally go about finding my site. But that's just kind of the beginning. Then I have to figure out if that site's actually suitable to build a power plant on. There's lots of factors, lots of constraints, and there's a very long due diligence process that goes into it. And in Texas, it's actually a little bit more efficient to do this work than in other parts of the country. And that's because the interconnection process is fairly efficient, and the permitting regime in Texas in general is more efficient and easier than in other parts of the country. So once I find a site and I enter into a long-term agreement with the landowner, or I purchase the land, then I can start my due diligence on the site to find out if I can actually build a project there. So let me go back to transmission, because one of the first things I need to do is file an interconnection application with ERCOT and with the transmission operator near my site. And basically I'm asking, can you fit my project on your lines at a certain point in time? And so I'll pay for them to study that project of them injecting that energy on the grid at that location. And that can take a year, year and a half maybe. That's going on. And then I'm doing some real estate level analysis and some environmental analysis at the same time to decide if there's endangered species, birds, land-dwelling animals, if there's watersheds or flood zones that I need to be aware of, if there's any archaeological or historical sites on these pieces of land that I need to be aware of or stay away from. If there's any permitting involved, which is usually a county-by-county kind of scenario in Texas, and in West Texas out in the rural areas, there's not too many formal permitting regimes, which makes it, a little bit easier on me trying to get these projects built. But so I like to say that developing in Texas is more of an art than it is a science, because in California, for example, you have a very rigid permitting process. You have to get approved by the county and various other stakeholders, and you really know that process is going to take a few years. You kind of know what the steps are going to be. But in Texas, it's a little more fluid, and I don't have a permitting process to give me a very strict process for permitting. But I could run into other issues that aren't under the jurisdiction of a permitting regime. In Texas, we have a very good economic development incentive for businesses. We can apply for tax benefits, and those tax negotiations go on with the county, and that's kind of the county level permitting process, if you will. We're asking the county for tax incentives for us to bring our project to their county, and there are negotiations that are involved in that. And then once I kind of and concurrently, I'm doing some other things. I'm doing geotechnical analysis on the soils and what's underneath the surface to understand if I can build my foundations of my wind turbines here, or if I can, build the foundations for my solar farm, or pile drive the racks for my solar panels down into the ground. And sometimes, it's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple thing, but it can be a project killer if you dig down 2 feet and there's just a bed of rock, and that'll add a substantial amount of cost for me when I'm trying to build a solar farm or a wind farm. So I'm doing geotechnical analysis, and a lot of those components go into the actual design of the project, which my engineering crew will do. And at the same time, I'm trying to find a buyer for the project. Now, in Texas, to simplify, there's 2 ways of doing it. You can enter into a long-term power purchase contract called a PPA, power purchase agreement, with a utility or another electricity provider. Or I can take a little bit more risk on the pricing and try to sell my energy into the market on a day-ahead basis or a real-time basis and try to play the prices that way. So all of those things really have to come. I have to have a clean environmental analysis, clean archaeological historical surveys, clean permitting, county-level agreements in place, and I have to sell the power. And then once all those things come into place, then I can have a project that I can actually finance and build. And so that can take anywhere from a year and a half to 3 years in ERCOT under good circumstances. And that's it in general terms. And I'd like to leave time for Q&A because that's where the real fun begins. So thanks. I'd like to give a plug for our new Texas Solar Power Association as well. You don't have slides.
What do you need for the recording?
Here we go. That should be on.
I don't like to be recorded. So I was trying to think of what to talk about walking down here. I'm very fortunate in that I get to work with a lot of great solar companies, E.ON and First Solar being two of them. And I really get to see behind the scenes of all the different functions and job duties and just the day-to-day life of working in solar. So first I'd like to start off, how many people here want to work in solar or interested in being somehow tied to the solar industry? That's great to see. So I thought I'd talk about what is it like to actually work in the solar industry, since a lot of you are going to be moving on in a year or two, and you're probably interested, well, what am I going to be doing, or what do I even want to do? I just know I want to be in this thing called solar. And that's sort of how I was about 3 or 4 years ago. I had started a law firm about 2 years after I got out of law school and was doing general practice law, family, litigation, stuff like this, and I really wasn't happy. And I just kept on having this calling to solar. And at the time, I had 3 attorneys that worked for me and 2 paralegals, and I sat them down all one day and I said, we're going to get into the solar business. And they just kind of looked at me, and within 6 months, almost every single one of them was gone. So it was a pretty scary time, and I didn't really know anything about energy. I remember asking the question, what is the difference between a KW and a KWH? I couldn't get that past my head. And so I quickly started going to all sorts of different solar events and started learning that it's not just some panels that you throw in the field. But it was also one of the best decisions I ever did because of the timing. You may be knowing this now, but just a couple years ago, there was this undercurrent in the solar industry. And it was being driven by the reduction of cost. And, solar has been around, commercial solar has been around for 50 years. But it's sort of been a way outlier and kind of tied to hippies and tree huggers. And it sort of had it's the environmental friendly thing to do. It wasn't the business thing to do. And as those costs have come down, what Colin was talking about is that for the very first time ever, that panel that's out there in the field is actually producing cheaper energy than that sophisticated natural gas plant over there on Decker Lake or somewhere else nearby. And that is a fundamental change to our industry, because that solar panels can go out into a field out in West Texas, but they can also go on our rooftop. And so now we have something that's even completely different than what our traditional utility is based on, which was big power plants sending, far away from the energy load or where it's being consumed, sending that over large transmission lines to those load pockets, to now, as solar has become more and more cost affordable, we're seeing this sort of evolution or revolution of distributed generation. And for instance, in California, we now have over 3 gigawatts of solar in California, and the majority of that being rooftop. And so we have two things going on. We have the utility scale solar taking off because of its competitive pricing, and now we have distributed solar. And then we even have even more technological innovations that are coming. So has anyone heard of Elon Musk and his Tesla? Well, those same batteries that are in that car, they've also decided to put into a stationary storage pack. And I've been at the factory and I've seen them, and they use the same software, and they can communicate with the grid, and they can regulate with the load and follow the load profile of the building that they're located at. And then you tie on some solar, and now you have what a lot of people like to call grid defection. And that has a lot of utilities concerned. And so everybody is trying to figure this out. We don't want to just lose our utilities. We still need utilities to service our needs. But we also have to have this marriage of these new technologies coming in. And what that has done is really created a whole new space for folks like you. Because there's all sorts of now new jobs that are popping up left and right. And I'm assuming, I think the topic is renewables in Texas, but really this is renewables globally, because this is not just occurring in any one centralized location. And so as we step outside and you start looking about, well, what do I want to do? Well, what are you passionate about? Are you passionate about software development? Are you passionate about engineering? Are you passionate about crunching down on Excel spreadsheets? Whatever it is you're passionate about, you can actually do that in solar now. My firm, which used to be a bunch of lawyers, we now have an engineer, we have a policy guy, we have a financial consultant, and we have a software guy, and we're actually getting ready to hire 3 more software people. And all doing work in the solar industry. And it's fun. I love going into my office now. I love trying to create something that will help bring either the cost of solar down or help Spivey's job or Colin's job easier when they're trying to site a solar project or get somebody to buy a project. Because I know as with the more and more solar we get or the more and more wind, we're now displacing those thermal or conventional generation resources and moving away from fossil fuels. So whatever drives you to solar, whether it's your disdain towards fossil fuels like me, or maybe you just think it's really cool, it really is a good feeling to actually go in and do something you love. And I think you guys are in a great spot because the market just is being born right now. And it's limitless. I mean, we have now 30, 40% year-on-year growth. I mean, that's unprecedented in any other industry. And you guys are just now getting in at the beginning, so you're going to see all of these technological innovations as you mature professionally with the industry. And I'm more than welcome, would love to sit down with any one of you if you want to ask questions about this field or that field. And I'm sure these guys would too. And that's another great reason why I love working in solar, is because I found that even these two companies who should be competitors, we all work together. Spivey just threw a plug for the Texas Solar Power Association. It's a bunch of solar companies, and there we are trying to figure out policy and ways that we can get more solar out to people working together. And I found that is rampant throughout. Whether I go to California and you have Solar City and Sunrun and Sungevity, they're all working together. It's an awesome place, and it's a good field to be in. So again, Austin's a great place. We've got a lot of great companies here, and good luck. You're going to have a good time. So, yeah.
What we're going to do now is actually put the chairs and have you guys come up so we can have an interactive session for the next 30 minutes or so.
I forgot to mention, if anybody is a GIS analyst, please come talk to me. We're hiring.
Actually, I can get started with the question. Putting their thoughts. Spivey, this is for you. Can you talk a little bit about the size of the projects, the wind farms that you have built and the solar projects that you're building, and how all of that has changed in the last 5 years or so, and what factors have led to those changes in the size of the projects?
Let's see. Well, we can talk about that. So I developed wind farms across the country from 2008 to 11, and I've been doing solar ever since. I'll talk in generalities again, but wind really doesn't work unless it's large scale. There's a lot of issues facing it, with the exception of some farm usage and stuff like that. But what we found is, my company, which is one of the largest wind producers in the country, the bigger, the better, and the more economic and the more viable in certain parts of the country. So, I would suggest that wind has sort of stayed at a larger utility scale level since the boom in the mid 2000s, and really don't see any indication that this size has changed that much. And when I say size, I'm talking about in Texas, 100 megawatts or greater. There are some exceptions, and in other parts of the country there are certainly exceptions. You can't cite a 100, 200 megawatt wind farm in Pennsylvania. It's just not practical. But in solar, I think Clay touched on it, there's so many more applications that even a utility scale developer and power plant owner like E.ON, my company, can't ignore the fact that we can do solar at 100 or 200 megawatts in West Texas, or we can do it at 500 kW or a megawatt in urban areas, closer to load, with less transmission risk and less transmission costs. And so I think you're really starting to see, I would say, a shift in the growth rate from utility scale solar implementation to larger or smaller scale or DG, even small utility scale level projects. You're going to really see a large growth in those kinds of power plants or rooftop systems in the future. It's already happening, but you're really going to notice it in the next few years.
He gets to pick.
Over here first.
So I was wondering if you all could comment. Now that solar and wind, the costs have come down to reasonable values and are competitive, and they're obviously clean, some great things. I was curious what your thoughts were on the issues that still exist with those two types of renewable systems, specifically solar, I guess, in terms of the uncertainty and intermittency that they create for the grid, and for solar, the issue with power quality and lack of having any real power injection, or excuse me, reactive power injection. And so how you foresee those issues as being addressed now or in the future?
So I can talk about this a little. I think we can all talk about this a little bit. It reminds me that I should probably share with you, for your work with the Weber Energy Group, some of the work that our company for solar has done on basically what we're calling sort of advanced controls, the grid-friendly PV plant. With utility scale PV, I think that you're able to address a lot of sort of the intermittency concerns. It's a combination of factors. If you've got tracking panels, then you're much better able to peak match, essentially. But at the same time, if you have the ability to control, inverters on an individual level at a utility scale plant, you have a lot of control then over the plant. So you can provide ancillary services support like frequency regulation. You can provide predictable up and down ramping. A lot of times I think it has to do with grid operators and policymakers sort of see a solar plant and think of like panels on somebody's roof, and then, or just a single panel. Whenever a cloud goes over, they assume it just shuts off completely, and they think a plant is like that too. But that's not the case. And at the same time, if you've got 10,000 homes with solar on the roof, it's not all going to happen at once. So some of it's about education, but and there are some real concerns. Reactive power, I don't think is an issue for our plants, but you guys may know more about that. I think, and I'm not the technical guy, so I feel silly. I'm representing a company that I can't tell you for sure. But we're able to provide some reactive power, is my understanding with our new capabilities. I think it's a combination of, the solar industry has and needs to continue to make some technological improvements to be able to better integrate with the grid, but we're already there to some extent, and to the extent that we're there, I don't think people on the policy side or the grid operations side are necessarily recognizing that fact.
I would just say, intermittency, so really what people sometimes who might attack solar say, that's too intermittent, we can't rely on that. They're really just talking about they'll get into clouds, right? And it really, if you really think about it, the more solar we have out in West Texas is a very large place. And the likelihood of a cloud covering entire West Texas is pretty unlikely, right? And so the more solar we actually put up, we actually reduce the intermittency of just depending on maybe one solar plant. Now we have 10 plants all spread out. And then the same thing applies on the DG side. Well, sure, like last night, we had a big thunderstorm, covered all of Austin, right? Well, what if that happens in the afternoon? Well, guess what? We're also turning down our air conditionings, and our load is going down. Because, less solar radiance means less heat, it's not as hot. So a lot of these things are just like Colin says, just educating. It's sort of urban legend myths, but there are truths to it. And I think that's where a lot of the technological innovations are coming from, is on the inverters, whether it's the large inverters at the Berea plant, which First Solar just put online this summer. It's actually participating with ERCOT to provide reactive power and provide potentially ancillary service products, to the DG side, where the inverters are smart grid capable and interacting with the grid, and then now you have solar plus storage that's really taken off at ERCOT, and then of course PJM with their solar type storage products. So it's a really fascinating space. It's not something the solar industry has ignored, and it's actually something that I think is going to be the next big sort of wave as storage starts coming married with solar, especially on the DG side.
I'm sorry, the way you talked about West Texas Solar brought up one other point that I think is really important, and actually it has to do with a presenter that Dr. Rai had here a few years ago, Jay Apt from Carnegie Mellon University. He's done some and his group has done some great research, and I think there's a very pervasive misunderstanding, whether it's throughout the U.S. or internationally. The thinking is that as you add more and more solar and wind on the grid, things become less reliable. But actually, the opposite is what happens. So, what Dr. Apt found in his research, and I'm sure he's updated, but I haven't looked at it in a few years, and he looked at wind in ERCOT specifically, was that on an intra-daily and intra-hourly basis. So, if we're talking about sub-24-hour intermittency and variability in generation. If you move from one wind power plant, if you move from 1 to, 12, the number was, and these are, 100 megawatt plants. So from 100 megawatt plant to 12 100 megawatt plants. That variability from wind generation in total is reduced by like 85%, I think. And then if you add, another like 15 or 20 plants, the entire intermittency is reduced by 95%. So that's an important thing to recognize, is actually, I think as the resource grows, it's a different kind of resource that grid operators aren't used to working with, and so there are some complexities there. But the resource as a whole actually does become more reliable.
Thanks. I think my question is for all speakers. The question is, the rapid decrease of solar installation costs is pretty well known. I want to further know what's your sense of how much of the cost reduction is driven by local factors, like the project developer, other perspective in terms of the soft cost. So can you give me a kind of your idea of what percentages? Thanks.
I'm gonna think about that one for a second.
Talk about it from a DG perspective first. Now it used to be the balance of system was sort of their largest cost, but now it's more on the cost to customer acquisition. meaning how many people did they have to have on the ground trying to get that sales, communicate with the customer, make sure they're happy, put the system on there. And then now, not only that, once you have that cost of customer acquisition, you still got to make sure that customer is happy for the life of those contracts, because a lot of these contracts tie the customer to the solar company. And so that's where there's a lot of technological innovations that it's occurring now, is about getting smarter about where do you actually market your solar company, or how do I get better leads for my company, how do I reduce my boots on the ground, and then also then focusing on the actual installation, how do I reduce those costs. So a lot of it's now soft costs, where a lot of the innovation is coming down as the balance of system is starting to level out. And then I can let these guys talk about the utility scale. It's always, you got to separate the two.
Well, I would just say that, I would suggest that panel prices, on a world market level, have leveled out to a degree lately, and maybe we'll even see some increase in that due to international relations. But and then the next thing that the industry's been focusing on are balance of systems, and so I think that's what everyone's really focusing on for the next level of price reduction, and then I would call soft costs, the next tranche. As far as a percentage of that is concerned, it's hard to say what that's going to look like.
Yeah, so the only thing and I haven't had a chance to look at it, but I just saw come across my email today. Lawrence Berkeley, I think National Labs now just released a study today looking specifically at things like permitting costs and soft costs and how they affect the price of solar. So it's worth checking out. I don't know what the answer is. I don't have anything else to add, but it's worth taking a look at, I think. Well, so you know the answer. Why are you asking the question? I'm just kidding.
The question is, if you break the cost reduction by different components, how much is driven by module cost, how much is driven by other components? That's my question.
I mean, I don't know if I can answer any. I think that the general perspective is that historically the majority of the cost decline has been driven by panel prices and other sort of technology prices, inverter prices, that sort of thing. But beyond that, I don't know. I do know that everybody that I talk to within our company and within the industry thinks there's a lot of room for cost reduction still on the soft cost side.
Hi. I have a question regarding distributed generation and what has to happen at the utility in order to enable that. Let's assume you have a city or a place somewhere and 50% of the residents there would like to participate in a distributed generation program. What then has to happen on the utility side in order to enable that?
That's a very complicated question, which means anybody getting into policy is guaranteed work. It's different everywhere you go. Just from a very high-level perspective, you have to see, is that a regulated market, meaning is there a vertically integrated utility like Austin Energy, a municipally owned utility, or is it a competitive market like Houston, where you have the retail electric providers separate from the generation providers and so forth. And once you sort of identify what market structure you're dealing with, well, if it's the municipally owned utility, it's really about just ground roots politics. And identifying good policy that works for everybody, for all the stakeholders involved. And I don't know how many people know this, but the city of Austin just 2 weeks ago just passed the largest solar goal in the country. And that was a lot of grassroots political folks getting together and saying, let's come at this from a business perspective. How much solar can we really do? And then let's work with our policy leaders to make sure we do it. And it's pretty fascinating. Politics is the cheapest form of entertainment, right? So
I don't know if it's that cheap. But.
Yeah. So, but anyways, there's going to be a lot of innovation. Now pulling out, we look at ERCOT. There's a group called the Emerging Technology Working Group at ERCOT, and on the 24th of September, there's going to be a really interesting. It's going to be a really interesting day over there, because they're going to have all these companies coming in talking about aggregated, distributed resources and how we start defining those in the ERCOT market and how they start interacting with the retail electric providers, the demand response providers, and how they fit. And that's a much bigger question because now you're dealing with a lot of different utilities and retail electric providers. So I would highly suggest if you can find the time to go through the ETWG meeting on the 24th, because you're going to see some really great leading thinkers go up there and present about their solutions to ERCOT and how they think it should be done.
And isn't the chair of the ETWG a Butler firm employee and former EER?
He happens to be
grad student. Okay,
yeah, and he used to, former student of Dr. Rice.
Yep.
So,
yeah.
So this question is for Spivey. In one of your slides, you were talking about site selection, and you suggested that tax incentives was a part of that. What is the incentive for the local area? Are there that many jobs that are associated once you've got the site situated? Or are there some incentives for the local community? Did they get some kind of cost reduction? Or is there a policy that's being built where they would get some kind of reduction in costs?
That's a good question. So the tax incentives in Texas are usually property tax based. You can get an abatement or a reduction in your property taxes to locate your power plant there. And that's common with not just our industry but others. You probably saw the Tesla Gigafactory battle between Texas and Nevada won that one by giving them $1.5 billion worth of tax incentives. I guess we couldn't match that. But to the rest of the question, so that dynamic is going on a location-by-location basis in West Texas and in other parts of the state. And I would ask you a question, though. Isn't it cool that we can operate a power plant, a large utility-scale power plant, with just one person? Isn't that cool? I would just suggest that the power plants we're building today are much more efficient than the ones of the past. Now, but I know that's not the exact point of your question. So they get a...
Suggest what's the incentive for that particular locality to give you?
Well, I would suggest that tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of tax base increase and tax revenue over the course of 30 years is the ultimate incentive. Yeah. It's either you're going to get that money, that tax revenue, or you're not.
So in West Texas, they're definitely not hurting for jobs. There's a thing called oil and gas out there. And it's actually very difficult to even build the solar plant because you got to compete with all the oil and gas companies that are drilling wells and so forth. So there's actually kind of a labor shortage out there. And I've actually talked to a lot of these county court commissioners and judges, and really it's the tax base. Because a lot of that oil and gas money doesn't go to them. But the solar plant, the tax revenue, you think about it, Pecos County, where the Berea project is, they have several solar projects there, and they just overnight increased their tax base by over $1 billion. And for an area that's been stricken with drought, that's lost a lot of their agricultural revenue, that is tremendous to them. A lot of these counties, like Reeves County and other counties, are actually on the verge of bankruptcy. So they see this as a new industry, a new sort of form of incentivization to keep money in the county. And it's really fascinating to hear how supportive the county leaders are when you go meet with them. And they're so anxious to get you out there and get your project in their county versus the next county.
And to be frank, that building one of these does provide dozens or maybe hundreds of temporary construction jobs, which is a temporary influx of cash and jobs to these counties and localities. But if we're comparing, oil and gas, that's the same thing. They come in with their wells and they drill them and then they leave and they have their pump jacks and there's no employees there either. And I know it's on a much larger scale, and if you've been to Midland or Odessa lately, it's crazy out there. And but I guess the point is on a project by project basis, it's kind of the same dynamic. Lots of jobs temporarily, go away, few jobs.
Hello. So yes, the Austin City Council passed a huge solar bill a few weeks ago back here. So
one of the arguments that Austin Energy was making was that they were making quite a bit of money from the Decker plant, selling energy to other municipalities. So when it comes to distributed solar in personal homes, how might that affect energy trading, or is that not part of the equation?
Yeah, so good question. So there was a press release by Austin Energy that quoted in 2011, Decker made, I think, $40 million or something like that. I forget the exact amount. And in 2011, everybody that was putting out power during peak times made money because we had a very, very hot summer.
It was the hottest summer on record in Texas.
So we had a very rare weather event. But if you look at the revenue from Decker from 2012 or 2013, you'll actually see that it was nowhere near the revenue that was coming in as in 2011. So it's a little bit skewed to just say Decker made money or makes money.
Did it lose money in one of those years, or?
It definitely lost money. So, but the Decker is over 50 years old. They're retiring it anyway. So, you know, it's not even really a fair comparison to compare a solar plant that can put out solar at $50 a megawatt hour versus Decker, which it costs maybe $150, $160 a megawatt hour. So just, again, don't always believe what you see in the papers, right? As the saying goes.
So, and I would just, you know, to the other side of the question in terms of how it affects Austin Energy's ability to sort of participate in the energy market and gain revenue from that. You know, whether it's distributed generation or utility scale generation, I think there are some differences in terms of how they affect Austin Energy's ability. But basically, when you're making an investment in a power plant, whether it's solar, gas, wind, whatever, what you're doing in the Texas marketplace is saying, I'm making a commitment, a long-term 20-year commitment, whatever it may be, for an asset that will allow me to participate in the market. And what you're doing with solar is you're making a commitment and an investment in an asset for a fixed price at $50 a megawatt hour in this particular, in the most recent bid that they got, instance or contract. So you're making an investment in a fixed contract for that number of years. And you will have the ability to either put that into the market, if it makes sense, or use it to cover your own internal demand. And whether that's wind, solar, or natural gas, Austin Energy is still going to have that ability. What they get out of solar that, in my opinion, they don't get from natural gas is a guaranteed price. Whereas with natural gas, there are a lot of things that are going to change over the next 5 or 10 years. Huge LNG exports. You know, there's already been a little bit of a tightening of the natural gas market. I don't think we're going to get back to 2008 where we saw $9 prices or anything. But even a half a dollar or $1 increase in the price of natural gas has a huge impact and already has had an impact. And Austin Energy is another good example of that. I know that they had to raise their fuel costs or their fuel charge for customers because of rising natural gas prices already. So it's a matter of balance from my perspective. If you're looking at it from a utilities point of view, in terms of how much of that do you want to have at a fixed cost, how much are you willing to expose yourself to the risk of natural gas costs and variations.
This is a question concerning utility-scale solar plants, and now I'm sure we don't have a dearth of land in Texas, but a lot of people like Robert Bryce, they talk about energy sprawl and how we use, more land per unit area. Now that we're gaining more acceptance, regarding solar, I was wondering if in practice, people are considering any alternate uses that go along with, all these utility-scale solar plants, like, some kind of farming or alternate revenue generation. And how that affects land acquisition. Thanks.
I don't. In my daily work, I mean, it's not my business. It's the landowner's business who I contract with to monetize the land to that ability. But Colin was going to mention desalination, and there's a discussion going on about how there's some new desalination plants that might be developed and how solar could play in a role with that to help power those plants. And that's kind of shifting from the utility scale somewhat to the distributed or more local power conversation. I think you see pictures of people grazing the land underneath the panels, and that's, there might be a marginal income utilization there. But I would say that West Texas is actually doing that as best as anybody is, with as much oil and gas activities out there on practically the same pieces of land with horizontal drilling. That can go pretty much anywhere. It can go underneath that solar farm if it wants, and really monetize it for its best uses out there.
So you mentioned Robert Bryce, and I just can't resist responding because Robert Bryce loves to talk about energy density. It's a thing that he can talk about when he's on a panel or being interviewed by somebody that nobody else is really going to be able to respond to and know about. And it's a great way of talking about, energy density, in his view, is what really drives value for energy. So the more dense the resource, the more valuable. So that's why coal is so great from this point of view. And of course my response to that is, when you can run a jet plane off of a nuclear power plant, maybe we'll have energy density driving all of the decisions. But the truth is, I mean, of course I'm an economist, so economics drives it all. And density is a part of that equation. But the fact of the matter is, we have the land in West Texas. I mean, I actually, at a commission workshop recently, the question came up about if we're going to build, just like ERCOT says, 10,000 megawatts of solar, if it's all in West Texas, how much does that equal? And I can't remember the number, but the Texas Solar Power Association kind of responded, and it was the size of like a small ranch, basically, in West Texas, one of many. And so energy density is an important issue, and it's something to take into account, but it fits into a larger equation, and it doesn't drive the value. What ultimately drives the value is, the cost of land, the cost of the asset, and the value of the energy. And what we're seeing in solar is when you put all of those things together, right now it's extremely competitive. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. I've read enough of his columns. So.
I think it's a great thing to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great theory.
Yeah.
It doesn't play out for me in the market today, necessarily. Because, I mean, I got lots of transmission space out there, lots of land. I'm going to go sort of that's the easiest way for me to do what I do.
Well, to be honest, you can't do a whole lot with that land anyway. I don't know if you've ever been out to West Texas, but...
I mean, you talked about a resurgence out in West Texas, and we saw a lot, pre this current oil boom, we saw a lot of that with wind, frankly. We saw a lot of old oil patch towns dying that were revived by a simple wind farm, just one in their community. And so it may not be as efficient on an energy density level, but maybe it is the most, maximizing the value of the land. Maybe that's the conversation.
So thank you all for being here. It's great to see you. A couple questions. So does the idea of locking in a PPA or being able to go merchant, is that really only available for a big company like E.ON? I know that Clay's been innovative over the last year with a merchant utility scale, but how available is financing for that type of model versus having a PPA?
Yeah.
And so is it really just a big player play? Secondly, do we need CREZ 2, or is CREZ that was built for wind really good enough to tie into, or do you just need smaller, not 345 kV, but you can just kind of tap in to some smaller scale sub-transmission to get to the best resource? My understanding from someone was that it's a little bit more south and west for the optimal utility scale, and CREZ was more in the optimal for wind. But is CREZ 2 underway as far as the thought, or can we use that?
I think, a lot of developers would like to see more transmission out the southwest because land is really cheap. But as far as the solar resource, it actually goes all the way up into the panhandle and has almost the same irradiation levels up north, even parallel with Colorado as they do down, in the valley and Big Bend and so forth.
So CREZ 1 is still really good for this.
I mean, we're not, we're the first major, I think, utility scale generation out in West Texas, and we're going to be at 30 megawatts in January or by the end of the year. Yeah. Like, we're not at a point today, I think, where, I mean, new transmission would always be nice. I mean, every generator wants to have, access right at their doorstep. But we're not at a point right now of running into a risk of maxing out the transmission that exists. We may be there. I think we'll be there sooner than ERCOT expects based on their analysis. But when we get to that point, it's going to be, my view of it is it's not going to be another CREZ. It's going to be, you know what, there's this one region with really cheap land and a really good solar resource, and we don't have transmission out there. And if we get transmission out there, we're going to have, you know, zero marginal cost peaking generation, which creates a great benefit to the end-use customers, which is how they make those transmission decisions. And, you know, to the first question, I mean, you know, so Berea is, we do not refer to it as a merchant plant. It is an open contract plant is the official term that we're using, but it's unhedged. You know, we don't have a contract for it, and we finance that internally. We have a big balance sheet. I don't know, you know, to the question, I don't know where other companies are looking in terms of their strategy. I think we're all bullish on solar and solar's prospects, and so you know, for us it was a fairly easy decision looking at the ERCOT market and where things are going.
Having a big company in their balance sheet, you know, back that initial investment, because it's all about that initial investment for a large solar plant, does make it easier to just say, okay, I'm going to go in without a contract. So what we're seeing is solar as an investment class or an asset class, those large institutional investors that were once just doing open market, wholesale market opportunities with natural gas and potentially wind are now really diving into the solar space. And so, you know, maybe we might start seeing the 8 to 10 megawatt projects poke up in congested load pockets, that it's very easy to sort of get comfortable with the upfront investment, but also forecasting what those nodal prices or the LMP prices are going to be for at least the next 5-6 years. And I think that's what we're going to see initially. And we're also going to start to see more financial innovation just in the hedge swap PPAs, where we're going to see a lot shorter term contracts with the excess capacity going into wholesale. And so it's going to be a real interesting place.
And then a final question about ITC for solar, PTC for wind. PTC, will it ever come back? And since we've got a wind expert, and also ITC 2016, do we think we'll get the cost down enough to where ITC going away in 2016 really won't matter?
I think on the ITC we don't have to worry about costs coming down, and we don't have to worry about the ITC going down 20%. I remember it's gone from 30% to 10% because of natural gas. You know, in this case, natural gas is our best friend because everybody's projection for natural gas looks like this, no matter if it's EIA or all the major hubs, it's all going up. And as those natural gas goes up, the marginal price of electricity goes up. Therefore, you know, we don't have to be at $50 a megawatt hour anymore to be competitive. Now we only have to be 60 megawatts or 70. And a lot of the cost to capital that is eaten up when financing a big project is through that tax equity. It's a difficult space and there's not very much of it out there. And so they can charge a higher IRR for that or a higher cost to capital. And so when you go down to 10%, it's also sort of, it's mitigated somewhat on your actual cost because now you're getting more traditional debt finance. And also makers will actually, you'll be able to claim more makers. So it's not as big of a jump as most people think it is.
Yeah, I would just, real quickly, I'll say, I do think the PTC will be extended. It'll be hard to say if it'll be extended on a long-term basis. You know, we've seen a lot of individual year, couple-year extensions. I think there really is a decent amount of support for it. Generally, it's just having to get it done through our legislative process, like anything these days, is tough. I don't know really about the ITC, whether we'll be there or not, but I think, you know, I think it'll probably be fought to extend that as well. And I think there is an understanding that whether or not it's the right mechanism or not, it's not a level playing field between other generators, and they have incentives at different parts of their supply chain and at their generation level as well. So if we can figure out what the right combination of incentives for all generators, then I think we'd all be happy to sit down and work things out. But
well, and you know, I completely. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You know, the other thing to keep in mind with the EPA, with the Clean Power Plan, states are supposed to submit their plan in 2016 to the EPA. I'm guessing. Does anybody want to take odds that Texas is going to sue? And so we may or may not submit a plan to the EPA. That's still up in the air. But there has been a lot of talk that we should have a backup plan because Texas hasn't had a great record with their lawsuits against the EPA in particular. But if you think about it at a very high level, you know, if it's complying with the Clean Power Plan, which is the greenhouse gas rule that the EPA just put out in June, or if somehow, you know, federal action actually takes place on climate and greenhouse gases, which I'm not particularly optimistic on. But if you think about it at a really high level, if you were to price carbon at, say, $20 a ton, I think the current social cost of carbon from the EPA is $40-something a ton for today. If you were to price it at $20 a ton, that's about $10 additional marginal cost for natural gas generation right there. And so, you know, these are other things to kind of keep in mind in terms of when you think about the future playing field, whether the ITC sticks around or not.
This has been a terrific discussion. Thank you for joining. And I know Spivey has to leave right away, but I believe maybe Clay and Colin can hang around if you guys want to you know, discuss anything with them. And Tiffany, do you want to remind again where the happy hour is?
Yeah, if y'all are interested in continuing the conversation, we're going to be heading over to Crown and Anchor to talk more about energy and have beers. So come out and join us.
I need software developers.
Any software developers?